On January 3, 2026, the United States executed an unprecedented military operation inside Venezuela that culminated in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores. U.S. Special Forces struck targets in and around Caracas under an operation codenamed Operation Absolute Resolve, deploying a wide array of military assets, including aviation units and elite army forces, in a lightning raid that stunned the world. Maduro was removed from his fortified residence and flown to New York to face federal charges, marking a dramatic escalation of U.S. involvement in Venezuelan affairs and one of the most consequential interventions in Latin America in decades. The Maduro government had presided over Venezuela since 2013, inheriting profound economic decline, political turmoil, and widespread allegations of corruption. Over the years, Venezuela's once dominant oil industry suffered a catastrophic collapse due to mismanagement, sanctions, and declining production, forcing millions of Venezuelans into exile and deepening humanitarian distress. Relations with Washington deteriorated sharply during Maduro's tenure, as successive U.S. administrations accused him of undermining democracy, rigging elections, and tolerating systemic abuses. Tensions intensified under the Trump administration, which formalized pressure campaigns, expansive sanctions, and public accusations that the Maduro regime was deeply complicit in international drug trafficking and organized crime networks. In the months leading up to the January raid, U.S. military and intelligence activity in the region increased markedly. American naval forces, including the USS Gerald R. Ford Strike Group, were repositioned in the Caribbean, and a sequence of strikes on vessels off Venezuelan waters were justified as attempts to disrupt trafficking routes allegedly tied to Caracas. According to U.S. officials, the operation that captured Maduro was the culmination of this months-long strategy, combining aerial suppression of air defenses with helicopter insertions to secure the target area, despite heavy resistance from Venezuelan and allied forces. Upon his arrival in the United States, Maduro was arraigned in a federal court in Manhattan on multiple charges that include drug trafficking, narco-terrorism conspiracies, and related violent crimes. The indictment alleges that Maduro and his inner circle collaborated with criminal organizations to facilitate the transportation of cocaine into the United States, used state power to protect trafficking networks, and engaged in violent acts, including kidnappings and murders. In court, Maduro pleaded not guilty and decried his capture as an unlawful abduction, asserting that he remains Venezuela's constitutional president and challenging the legitimacy of U.S. jurisdiction over a sitting head of state. U.S. authorities have described the charges as the result of a long-running investigation into Maduro's criminal activities, though the exact scope of evidence and operational connections remains a subject of scrutiny. Independent intelligence assessments have cast doubt on some U.S. assertions, particularly the claim that Maduro orchestrated direct involvement in foreign prison gang activities like Tren de Aragua, and have pointed out that Venezuela is not traditionally among the top sources of cocaine entering the U.S. market. These discrepancies have fueled debate over whether the legal case reflects objective criminal accountability or serves wider strategic goals. The U.S. administration, for its part, has framed the operation as part of a broader war on narco-terrorism, connecting the Maduro regime's alleged corruption and criminality with threats to American public health and security. President Trump publicly stated that the United States would run Venezuela temporarily, asserting that American oil companies would help rebuild the nation's devastated energy sector and that oil revenues would offset the costs of the operation. This rhetoric resonated with long-standing debates in Washington over Venezuelan oil and U.S. energy interests, but it also ignited fierce criticism about motives, raising concerns that resource acquisition and regional dominance are primary drivers rather than legitimate law enforcement goals. The legality of the U.S. intervention has drawn harsh scrutiny from legal scholars, international organizations, and foreign governments. Experts note that unilateral military action to depose and capture a sitting foreign leader without United Nations Security Council authorization, clear self-defense justification, or invitation from the host government constitutes a violation of international law, particularly Article 2, 4, of the UN Charter prohibiting the use of force. Critics argue that the operation sets a dangerous precedent for international relations, undermining the norms of state sovereignty and non-interference that have been central to the post-World War II global order. Reactions from the international community have been sharply divided. Several states, including Russia, China, and Iran, condemned the intervention as a blatant breach of sovereignty, while other nations emphasized respect for international legal frameworks and called for restraint. The United Nations held emergency consultations to address the legal and humanitarian implications, and the UN Secretary-General expressed concern about the implications for global security norms. At the same time, some governments and opposition figures celebrated Maduro's removal, seeing it as a potential turning point for restoring democracy and accountability in Venezuela. The operation's impact on Venezuelan society has been profound and immediate. Reports indicate that dozens of Venezuelan, Cuban, and allied personnel were killed in the fighting, and the chaotic aftermath saw both celebrations and violent unrest. U.S. citizens were urged to leave Venezuela due to rising security threats, including reports of armed paramilitary groups targeting foreigners. Within the country, the Supreme Court installed Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as acting president, a move rejected by the United States and opposed by Maduro loyalists, further complicating the nation's political fracture. On the information front, state and non-state actors alike have engaged in extensive narrative influence operations. Russian and Chinese networks disseminated contradictory, misleading, and conspiratorial content about the capture, aiming to confuse global audiences and undermine confidence in official accounts. These campaigns reflect broader patterns of digital influence warfare, where misinformation and disinformation amplify geopolitical flashpoints and make it harder for individuals to discern verified information amid a flood of manipulated content. Economically, the future of Venezuela's oil industry, which holds some of the largest proven reserves in the world, remains uncertain but central to any discussion of reconstruction and recovery. U.S. officials have hinted at easing oil sanctions and engaging international financial institutions to unlock frozen assets, signaling potential shifts in policy that could revitalize production. Yet revitalization requires substantial investment, political stability, and legal assurances to international companies wary of past expropriations and ongoing instability. The broader geopolitical ramifications of the U.S. action are extensive. Beyond immediate U.S.-Venezuela relations, the intervention has reverberated through Latin America and beyond, reshaping alliances and prompting concerns about regional stability. It has also intensified strategic competition between the United States and China, which had deepened economic and infrastructure ties with Caracas in previous years, and exposed tensions in U.S.-Russia relations over influence in the Western Hemisphere. For Venezuela's 31 million citizens, the path forward is fraught with complexities. The temporary absence of Maduro and the installation of a contested interim government do not immediately resolve the deep political, economic, and humanitarian crises that have persisted for years. Many Venezuelans hope for democratic renewal and economic recovery, while others fear renewed conflict, foreign domination, or further societal fragmentation. As Venezuela enters an uncertain chapter, the long-term effects of the U.S. operation, legally, politically, and socially, will continue to unfold, shaping the future of the nation and the international norms governing state conduct. Beyond conventional military force, the U.S. operation relied heavily on advanced technological and psychological warfare tools, signaling a shift toward intimidation-based dominance rather than sustained occupation. Among the most controversial was the reported use of long-range acoustic devices, RADs, during the Caracas raid and surrounding operations. RADs emit highly directional, high-decibel sound waves capable of causing intense pain, disorientation, and temporary hearing damage, and have previously been used for crowd control, maritime interdiction, and psychological deterrence. Witness accounts from Caracas described overwhelming sonic pressure that forced civilians and security personnel alike to retreat indoors, contributing to confusion and panic during the early hours of the operation. U.S. officials have framed the deployment of such technologies as a means of reducing casualties by incapacitating resistance, without widespread gunfire. However, human rights advocates argue that LRAD use in densely populated urban areas crosses ethical boundaries, particularly when civilians are exposed without warning. Medical professionals have warned that prolonged exposure can cause lasting auditory and neurological harm, and critics contend that its use blurred the line between military necessity and collective punishment. In Venezuela's case, the technology amplified the shock of the operation, ensuring rapid compliance while embedding fear deep into the civilian population. The psychological impact of the intervention extended far beyond Caracas. Across the Caribbean and northern South America, governments and citizens alike reacted with unease as footage and reports circulated of a sitting president being forcibly removed by a foreign power. Analysts note that the overwhelming display of U.S. technological superiority, including satellite surveillance, electronic warfare, drone reconnaissance, and acoustic weapons, functioned as a regional warning. The message was unmistakable. Resistance to U.S. strategic interests could invite swift and technologically overwhelming consequences. This perception has contributed to accusations that the operation amounted to strategic fear-mongering, deliberately designed to deter not only Venezuelan resistance, but also neighboring states and rival powers operating in the region. Latin American leaders, even those critical of Maduro, express concern that the precedent undermines regional sovereignty and revives memories of Cold War-era interventions. For many, the operation evoked a return to an era when U.S. power projection in Latin America was enforced through shock, intimidation, and regime change rather than diplomacy. The fear generated by the intervention was further magnified through information channels. Reports of sonic weapons, precision strikes, and near-total airspace control spread rapidly across social media, often exaggerated or distorted, compounding public anxiety. In some countries, rumors circulated that similar operations were being prepared elsewhere, prompting protests, emergency diplomatic consultations, and increased military alertness. Experts in security studies argue that this atmosphere of uncertainty was not incidental, but rather an extension of modern hybrid warfare, where psychological dominance is as critical as physical control. For Venezuela's population, the combination of military force and psychological pressure has left lasting scars. While some citizens welcome Maduro's removal, others described a pervasive sense of vulnerability, fearing that the same tools used against the regime could be turned on civilians in moments of unrest. The use of advanced coercive technology has complicated narratives of liberation, raising difficult questions about whether the operation delivered justice or simply replaced one form of fear with another. Thank you for watching, and remember to like and subscribe for more News Guru Now content.